Hola, what's the weather like where you are today? Sunny, rainy, cloudy? Comment below.
"You're not welcome here anymore," Dad said, halfway through his cherry pie, without even looking up. He just kept sawing at the crust like I wasn't a person, like I was just another damn inconvenience he finally got tired of. And I didn't say anything. Not then. Not one word. I didn't ask why. I didn't beg or cry or scream. I just stood up, walked upstairs, packed my bag, and said one thing on my way out. Calm, cool, and straight into his chest. "By the way, your power and water bills? Those were from me." He didn't say a word. He just stopped chewing, slowly wiped his mouth with that stupid cloth napkin he always insisted on using, and reached for his phone. That was the last thing I saw before I turned around and walked out of the house that had never felt like home. Not even when I was 10. Let me tell you how we got there. Because it wasn't sudden. Nothing in my family ever is. We rot slow, like fruit in the back of the fridge that nobody wants to admit went bad. It had been 9 months since my marriage collapsed. And I use that word, collapsed, because it didn't just end. It folded in on itself like some hollow cardboard box that had been pretending to hold weight for years. Luke cheated, yes, but honestly, by the time I found out, I felt more relief than rage. It was the excuse I needed to finally stop pretending we were fine. But divorce isn't just paperwork. It's a slow unpeeling of your skin, financially, emotionally, socially. After losing the house, burning through my savings, and hitting a wall with my job, I had nowhere else to go, so I called my dad. That was my first mistake. When I pulled into the driveway of his old 2-story in western Pennsylvania, the porch light was out, the steps still creaked the same way they had when I was 17, and the American flag he'd hung 20 years ago was now faded, frayed at the edges, and clinging to the pole like it was embarrassed to still be there. It hadn't changed, but I had. I wasn't a girl anymore. I was a woman, freshly divorced, broke, tired, and frankly numb. But I wasn't stupid. I knew who my father was. A man who said little, expected much, and gave even less. But I told myself, just a couple months, just until I get my legs back under me. He opened the door wearing that same navy flannel he always wore, as if he was halfway between chopping wood and going to bed. He didn't hug me, didn't ask how I was. He just said, "I cleared the guest room. Rules are the same. The rules. God, the rules. No visitors. No loud TV after 10. Dishes done right after dinner. No shoes in the house, unless they were his boots, which somehow were sacred. And don't ask for anything unless you've tried doing it yourself twice." That was his version of love. Discipline. Independence. He never hit me, never drank, never screamed. But growing up with him felt like walking on eggshells. Except the eggshells were glass, and you had to clean up your own cuts. Still, I played along. I said thank you. I kept to myself. I made sure dinner was hot when he came home from his part-time job at the hardware store, and I fixed up the leaky kitchen sink that had been dripping since I was a kid. He didn't say thank you. He just nodded once, like I was a plumber he didn't want to pay. A couple weeks in, I started noticing things. The fridge was full, but he never mentioned groceries. His mail kept stacking up unopened, so I sorted it, paid off his overdue power bill using my card, and told myself he'd pay me back when things got better. He didn't. Instead, he started acting like I owed him for the roof over my head. Never mind, I was paying half the bills and all the groceries. Then one afternoon, I found the first receipt. It was folded inside a book in the living room, like he didn't want anyone to see it. It showed a bank deposit, $2,000, cash. Just 2 days after he told me he was tight on money and couldn't chip in for the gas bill. That was the moment something flipped inside me. Not because he had money, but because he lied. Because he looked me in the eye, knowing I'd been bleeding myself dry to keep the lights on, and told me there was nothing he could do. I realized then that he didn't need help. He needed someone to control. It wasn't about survival, it was about power. He didn't want me there because he cared. He wanted someone to make his life easier while reminding them every day how hard he had it. And me, I was perfect for that. A divorced daughter crawling back home, a walking, talking failure. But he didn't realize I'd been watching, counting, calculating. The neighbors, especially Becky from next door, would always smile and ask how I was holding up. And I'd smile back, say, "Just fine," even though Becky once told me, "Your dad was never the warm type, huh?" That meant something, coming from a woman who knew him since before I was born. Still, I stayed. Not because I needed to, but because I started seeing the cracks in his world. The loose ends, the little messes he couldn't clean up anymore. And I realized, for the first time in my life, I had leverage, but I didn't use it. Not yet. I waited. Because if there's one thing growing up with a man like Ed teaches you, it's patience. I didn't know exactly when or how he'd show his true face again. But I knew it was coming. And when it did, when the moment finally cracked open like that burnt pie crust on his plate, I would be ready. And oh, was I ready. Have you ever helped someone only to have them treat you like you were the burden? Like your kindness was just a down payment on future silence? I wonder what you'd have done in my shoes. Because me, I didn't fight, I didn't cry. I just turned around, walked out, and took the lights with me. And that was just the beginning. Living with my father wasn't just a temporary arrangement. It became a daily lesson in silent war, a kind of emotional chess where no one declared their moves, but every piece was meant to intimidate. By the third week, I already knew where I stood. Not as a daughter in need, not even as a guest, but as an unwanted employee who had somehow shown up for a job no one posted, and whose paycheck came in the form of cold nods and an unspoken, "Be grateful you're here." It wasn't loud, it wasn't cruel in any obvious way, but it was so thick with judgment and passive aggression that every room in that house felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something, anything to explode. Except it never did, not yet. My father had a way of making you feel small without saying anything explicitly insulting. He didn't shout, didn't insult directly. That would have required more emotional engagement than he ever offered. No, he dismissed. He rolled his eyes when I offered suggestions about the broken garage door. He muttered figures when I said I was still looking for full-time work. And when he wasn't criticizing, he was simply silent. A silence that said, "You're in the way, and don't forget it." And every time I thought I'd earned an inch of goodwill, like when I cleaned out the gutters or fixed the garbage disposal, he'd glance at it and say something like, "Should have called a guy, could have done it right." That was his version of praise, subtle sabotage wrapped in a grunt. It was a chilly Wednesday morning when Becky from next door waved at me over the fence, her garden gloves still on, dirt on her cheek like war paint. She was the only warmth on that entire street, the kind of widow who baked too much and shared too often. I told her the gutters were finally cleared out, and she chuckled, saying, "About time, right? Your dad's been sitting on that for months. Told me he couldn't afford the repairs." Then she paused, squinted, and added, "Though that's strange, isn't it? He told Gary from the VA meeting he just got a little windfall from one of his old buddies. Bought himself that new recliner last week, didn't he?" I smiled, nodded politely, but inside my chest tightened. Not with shock, but with recognition. There it was again, the lie. The carefully crafted illusion of struggle, poverty, and pride that he wore like a badge to keep the world at bay, and me under his thumb. That afternoon, I waited until he left for the store and slipped into his den. I wasn't snooping for secrets. Not really, I just wanted confirmation of what I already knew deep down. And there it was, a bank statement half crumpled on his desk, open to a transaction for a private account I'd never seen before. It wasn't massive money, just enough to live better than he let on. But it was the dishonesty that struck me more than the dollars. He was perfectly comfortable letting me believe he was hanging on by a thread, even as I stretched every dime from my divorce settlement to keep the lights on and the water running in his house. That was when the shift happened. Not in him, but in me. Something about seeing it in black and white, the numbers, the lie, the proof, made it impossible to keep playing the role I'd assigned myself. I had come back thinking I was the daughter doing the right thing, helping the aging father who had no one else. But this wasn't mutual survival. This was a trap. A guilt-rigged cage that he'd quietly built around me, hoping I'd keep feeding the fire out of duty, while he sat back and basked in the glow. I didn't confront him, not right away. That's the thing about people like him. If you come at them with facts, they twist, they spin, they make you question what you saw, what you read, what you felt. I'd seen it before. He'd say, "It's not what it looks like," or worse, "Why are you looking through my stuff?" And suddenly I'd be the villain for noticing the truth, so I said nothing, but I started planning. I made a spreadsheet. Every bill I'd paid, every grocery receipt, every repair I made with my own money. I backed up emails, downloaded statements, even started forwarding his utility invoices to my account so I'd have full records. I began moving quietly, not out of fear but out of clarity. Because now I knew this wasn't my home, and it never had been. It was a battlefield disguised as a family house, and if I was going to leave again, it wouldn't be crawling. It would be walking, straight and slow, with him watching as the pieces fell around him. The boiling point came at a town event, of all places. Some community feature at the local rec center. The mayor was shaking hands, a photographer was snapping pictures, and someone had brought in a local news crew to highlight everyday heroes. Somehow, and I still don't know who nominated him, my father was chosen for his dedication to maintaining his property despite hardship. I stood beside him as he gave a short statement, talking about how hard it was to keep things running with only Social Security and a few savings. He even said, "Thank God I had the strength to fix that leaking kitchen myself." I froze. He didn't glance at me. He didn't stumble. He just lied, into a camera, on record, to strangers. That was it. That was the moment the last string snapped. Because in front of a room full of people, he erased me, took credit for my work, my money, my time. He used my hands and claimed them as his own. And in that instant, something settled inside me. Not rage, not sadness, but purpose. You can only humiliate someone so many times before they stop waiting to be treated right and start rewriting the script entirely. He didn't know it yet, but I was already rewriting his. One quiet move at a time, and I wouldn't stop until the last chapter was mine. There's a particular kind of fury that doesn't roar, doesn't scream, doesn't throw dishes against the wall or slam doors in the middle of the night. No, this fury simmers. It cooks slowly, like a pot of thick stew left on the back burner, heavy with memory and bitterness, gaining weight and substance until it's no longer just anger, but something more permanent, more dangerous. And that was exactly the place I found myself in, after watching my father publicly claim the work of my hands, as though I hadn't spent hours beneath that damn sink tightening pipes with tools he didn't even own. He stood there, in front of the local news and half the town, and told a lie so polished it gleamed like truth. And in that moment, I realized that revenge didn't have to come in the form of screaming matches or dramatic exits. It could be quiet, it could be patient, and it could cut deeper than any loud confrontation ever could. I started small, because subtle revenge is like planting seeds. You don't rip the tree out of the ground. You let it grow until the roots are tangled so tightly around everything they can't be undone. The first thing I did was transfer all the utilities, power, water, gas, into my name, which I could do easily since I was the one who had been paying them anyway. I changed the online passwords, set up alerts, and routed all communication through my own email account, knowing full well he didn't even remember the Wi-Fi password, let alone how to access a digital account. If he ever questioned it, I would have told him the truth. I just wanted to keep things streamlined. But he didn't question it, because like most men who think they've won, he stopped paying attention once he thought he had the upper hand. Next, I started going through the old files in the hallway cabinet, the ones labeled in his tight military-style handwriting, taxes, insurance, VA. I wasn't looking to steal anything, but I needed information, and what I found was more useful than I could have imagined. There were records of income he never reported to the VA, a handful of checks from a side business he used to run, and even some investment account statements I'd never seen. Nothing outright illegal, not that I could prove, but enough to raise eyebrows if the right agency asked the right questions. I didn't do anything with them right away. That would have been premature. I simply copied them, scanned them into a cloud folder he didn't know existed, and began compiling a quiet dossier, one breadcrumb at a time. Around that same time, Luke, my ex-husband, the man who had once promised me forever and then traded it in for a woman who still posted selfies with dog-ear filters, reached out of all people with a manila envelope of old documents he'd found while clearing out our storage unit. I expected useless junk, maybe old bank statements or warranty slips. But what I found instead made me pause. Tucked inside was a financial disclosure form from our joint filing days, where I had listed a $7,000 personal loan I'd given to my father 10 years ago to help him catch up on the mortgage. I had completely forgotten about it, buried under all the other disappointments, but seeing it written out, notarized and signed in his own slanted script, brought back everything. He never paid me back. He never even mentioned it again. And now, sitting on my bed in a house that never once offered warmth, I stared at that signature like it was a challenge. One night, after he went to bed, early like always, after 3 beers and 2 episodes of some show, where men rebuild cars and grunt a lot, I found the safe behind the laundry room paneling. It was the same one we had growing up, hidden behind a loose board and protected with a code I figured out in under 5 minutes, because he'd used my birthday. That almost made me pause, made me think maybe he cared more than he showed. But that thought vanished the moment I opened the door and saw what was inside. Cash. At least $4,000, in neat stacks, plus a small black notebook with scribbles about things I didn't understand. Names, numbers, maybe debts or favors. It didn't matter. What mattered was this man, who had let me believe he was living on the edge, who told me he couldn't afford basic repairs, had been hoarding resources like some post-apocalyptic prepper, while I quietly bled myself dry for his comfort. I took nothing, not then, but I photographed everything. I made copies, logged serial numbers, and closed it all back up, careful not to leave a trace. This wasn't theft. This was evidence. The final piece was the anonymous tip. I waited until he'd gone to a vet meeting. The same one where he bragged about barely scraping by to other men wearing the same faded caps and clinging to the same bitterness. And I wrote the letter on my laptop, then printed it at the library across town. I sent it to both the IRS and the VA, listing irregularities, citing exact amounts, and leaving just enough breadcrumbs that they'd be compelled to take a second look. I didn't lie, I didn't exaggerate, I just nudged a truth into motion. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't about breaking someone. It's about letting them trip over the very lies they built their lives on. And trust me, my father had built a palace on top of them. I could have walked away with my dignity, my head high, and my bank account empty. I could have cut the cord clean and left the past where it belonged. But something inside me, something sharp and deep and unspoken, refused to let him win quietly. This time, I would be the one pulling the strings, and he wouldn't even see the puppeteer until it was far, far too late. There's a strange calm that washes over you once your plan is already in motion, a stillness that doesn't come from peace, but from control, from the quiet satisfaction of knowing that no matter what happens next, you've taken your hands off the steering wheel at precisely the right curve in the road, and you're watching the crash unfold in slow motion. And that's where I found myself on that final Sunday, the day it all finally unraveled. For him, not for me, when everything I'd spent weeks quietly arranging fell into place so perfectly that it felt like fate had finally leaned in and whispered, "Now." It started the way most ordinary betrayals do, with food on the table, silence in the air, and that unbearable ticking of a kitchen clock that had hung on that same wall since the early 90s, its ticking louder than any words either of us spoke. My father had made dessert that night, which was rare and somehow worse, because it meant he was about to say something rehearsed, something final. He never baked unless there was a performance involved. And as I watched him carefully slice into that cheap, store-bought cherry pie, the same one he used to buy for my mother on her birthday, like it was some grand romantic gesture instead of a $5 guilt offering, I knew exactly what was coming before the words ever left his mouth. "You're not welcome here anymore," he said, with the same tone you'd use to tell a waiter your food was cold, detached, and impersonal, as if kicking out your own daughter was as routine as checking the mail. He didn't meet my eyes. He just kept slicing through that crust, letting the filling spill onto the plate like it was nothing, and all I could do was nod. Not out of shock. I was long past being shocked, but because I had been waiting for this moment with such careful, practiced anticipation that when it finally arrived, it felt like standing in the eye of a storm I had spent weeks building, brick by brick, lie by lie, thread by careful thread. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't ask him why, because I already knew. In his eyes, I had served my purpose. I had paid the bills, fixed the things he was too stubborn or lazy to address, kept the house running while he played the aging martyr, and now, with tax season approaching and people starting to ask questions about certain discrepancies in his benefits and income, it was far safer to send me packing than to deal with the uncomfortable truth that he had depended on me far more than he ever intended to admit. He wanted me gone not because I was a burden, but because I knew too much. And in his world, knowledge was a threat, especially when held by a woman who no longer needed his approval. So I stood up, slowly, carefully. I took my plate to the sink, rinsed it off like I had done every night for the past 7 months, and walked upstairs. I didn't slam drawers. I didn't throw things into my suitcase. I folded my clothes, packed my laptop, zipped up the bag I had bought back in college, and walked down those stairs one last time with a posture so calm, so deliberate, it could have been mistaken for grace. And just as I reached the door, hand on the knob, I turned and said the one sentence I had rehearsed in my head for weeks, the line that would land harder than any insult ever could. "By the way, your power and water bills? Those were from me." He stopped mid-bite, the fork still in his hand, the pie still bleeding onto the plate. His mouth didn't open. He didn't protest. He didn't defend himself or offer an excuse. He just sat there, frozen, the way someone sits when they realize too late that the story they've been telling for years has just been ripped open at the seams. And then, because men like him always reach for control when they've lost it, he slowly reached for his phone, likely to call someone, maybe one of his friends at the VA, maybe to cancel an account he didn't even know I'd closed that morning. But I didn't wait to find out. I opened the door, stepped outside, and didn't look back. That night, I stayed with Becky next door, who had long suspected the truth but had never said it out loud. Over tea, she told me something that stopped me cold. "You know," she said, "your father's been getting visits from the IRS folks. Plain clothes, not knocking loud, but they've been by. I figured it was nothing, but now, well, now I'm starting to wonder." And I smiled, not because I was proud, but because for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of what would happen next. I had spent so long tiptoeing around that man's moods, his pride, his unspoken rules, and now, finally, the consequences were his alone. 2 days later, the utilities were cut. Not because I wanted to be cruel, but because the accounts were in my name, and I wasn't about to keep footing the bill for a man who had treated me like a tenant in my own bloodline. The lights went out, the water stopped running, and according to Becky, who was now my unofficial eyes and ears, he had been calling the power company all morning, yelling into the void, demanding answers he wasn't going to get. Because there were none, not for him, not anymore. The fallout was quiet but precise. Letters started arriving. From the VA, from the IRS, even one from a lawyer representing an old family estate I never knew existed. It turned out my mother, before she died, had left a small trust in my name, one my father had quietly hidden, never mentioning it, never disclosing it even during my divorce, when I could have used every cent to keep myself afloat. He had buried that truth the way he buried everything, deep, silent, and out of reach. But now the truth was digging itself out, clawing through paperwork, unraveling the legacy he thought he controlled. And me, I didn't gloat. I didn't text or call or show up at his door. I let it all unfold naturally, like gravity doing its job. Because revenge, real revenge, doesn't come in shouting or slamming doors. It comes in silence, in stillness, in walking away with everything and saying absolutely nothing while they try to figure out how it all fell apart. He thought he was cutting me off. He didn't realize I was the one holding the switch. In the weeks that followed my departure, something strange began to happen. Not sudden or dramatic, not the kind of chaos that arrives with sirens and slammed doors, but a slow unraveling, a quiet disassembly of a life that had always seemed too tightly stitched to fall apart without notice. It came in subtle ways at first, through snippets from Becky who, without ever asking, had taken it upon herself to keep me updated, not out of nosiness, but out of something that resembled justice, a soft-spoken solidarity with a daughter who had finally stood up to a man who'd spent his entire life convincing others he was the victim of every story he told. She'd mentioned casually that his mailbox was suddenly more crowded than usual, filled not with the usual catalogs and grocery coupons, but with envelopes bearing seals that made even her nervous. IRS, VA compliance review, legal firms whose names she didn't recognize. She'd say things like, "He looked pale today," or, "I saw him sitting on the porch at noon, just staring out like he forgot what the street was supposed to look like." And every time she told me these things, I would smile politely, never asking for more details, because I didn't need confirmation. I already knew that the threads had begun to fray, and yet, for all the satisfaction I should have felt, there was an unexpected hollowness in the quiet. Not guilt, no, not that, but something closer to a strange ache, the kind that only comes when you realize the fight is over. The victory is yours, and yet the weight of the battle still hangs around your shoulders like wet cloth. I had won, yes. I had executed every move with precision, exposed every hidden lie, taken back the power that had been siphoned from me for decades. But what I hadn't prepared for, what no revenge fantasy ever truly accounts for, was the silence that comes after, the realization that closure isn't loud or triumphant. It's empty, it's standing in your own apartment alone, with no more plans to make, and wondering what kind of person you've become when all the noise is gone. It was about 3 weeks later when I got the call. A voicemail, actually, left while I was at the grocery store, debating between two brands of overpriced almond milk. I remember hearing the name of the law office first. A clipped, efficient voice that made no effort to cushion the message. They had been trying to reach me about the family trust my mother had established years ago, one that had somehow remained in limbo due to paperwork errors and delayed filings. At first, I assumed it was a scam. I'd heard of these things, companies pretending to have money waiting, only to ask for fees and bank details. But when I called back, and they recited my full name, my mother's maiden name, and the address of the house I grew up in, I realized this wasn't fiction. This was something my father had hidden, intentionally, precisely, and for so long that he must have convinced himself it was rightfully his. The sum wasn't enormous, not the kind of windfall that changes lives overnight, but it was enough to rewrite a few chapters, enough to pay off the remainder of my debt, secure a better apartment, and maybe, finally, give me the stability I had been clawing toward since my marriage collapsed. And yet, when the lawyer said, "You were always the sole beneficiary. Your mother wanted it that way," something cold settled in my chest. Not shock, not anger, but the realization that the betrayal had started long before I ever came back home. He had stolen not just money, but a piece of my mother's final intent, twisted it into something convenient, buried it beneath the weight of his own narrative. He had taken her legacy and made it disappear. And still, I didn't call him. I didn't send a letter or a text or a legal notice. I did nothing. Because part of me wanted him to sit in that house, day after day, wondering what had gone wrong, Not just with the power, not just with the audits, but with his daughter, with the version of me he thought he'd broken enough to control. I wanted him to feel the weight of silence, to taste the bitterness of being left behind, not in rage, but in resolve. But life, as it always does, refuses to stay neatly contained. And so, late one Thursday evening, as rain slid down the windows and the world outside blurred into soft gray, my phone rang again. No voicemail this time, just the name on the screen, Ed. I stared at it for a long time, longer than I probably should have, watching it ring and thinking about all the things he might say. Maybe it was an apology. Maybe it was a demand. Maybe it was just silence, him on the other end waiting for me to speak first, like he always did. I didn't answer, but I listened to the voicemail when it came through, and what I heard wasn't anger or pleading or threats. It was just his voice, quieter than I remembered, hoarse around the edges, like he'd aged 10 years in the last 3 weeks, and all he said was, "I think we need to talk." Not "I'm sorry, Mick," not "you were right." Just that one sentence, loaded with everything and nothing, hanging in the air like smoke that won't clear. I didn't call back. Instead, I opened the envelope from the law office again, reread the letter from my mother's estate, and imagined her handwriting, her voice, her tired smile, and I thought about the years I spent trying to earn love from a man who didn't know how to give it, who wrapped his affections in control and called it responsibility. I thought about the girl I used to be, the woman I became, and the version of me that had quietly orchestrated a slow, devastating reckoning. And as I sat there in the calm that followed a storm of my own making, I whispered the words I never got to say out loud. Not to him, not to anyone. The words that had been buried in my chest for far too long. "You think I was the problem, huh, Dad? You raised me to survive wolves. Too bad you never realized I became one. I don't know what happens next. Maybe he finds a way to fix things. Maybe he doesn't. Maybe he calls again. Maybe I answer. Maybe I never do, but what I do know is this. I left that house with nothing but a bag, a name, and a truth he could no longer deny. And I didn't burn it all down. I just turned off the lights, shut the water, and let the cold come in. Sometimes that's more than enough.